from the Climate Coalition, who is going to introduce herself and the other guest speakers. Grace, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Almir. So as Almir said, my name is Grace Fisher. I'm the community organizer from the Climate Coalition, and we're really happy to be supporting this session here today. For those of you who don't know us, the Climate Coalition is the UK's largest group of people dedicated to action against climate change. We're a group of over 140 organisations, including the National Trust, Women's Institute, Oxfam and RSPB and more. Now, the organisers of Refugee Week asked us to run a session today on the connections between climate change and displacement and how we can bring refugee rights into our work on climate justice and vice versa. Now, I will be the first to admit this is something I have a lot to learn about and want to be thinking about a lot more. And this might be the same for many of you here with us today. So we've asked a number of speakers to join us today to help us all on that learning journey. Now, firstly, we've got Alex Randall, who works for one of our member organisations, Climate Outreach, and is their programme lead for Climate and Migration Coalition. Alex is a leading expert in climate-driven migration and displacement. He has over 15 years of experience leading projects on the connection between climate change, migration, and human rights. His research expertise covers some of the most complex situations and crises, with publications focusing on climate-driven displacement and conflict in Syria and the Horn of Africa. Secondly, we're joined by Yakobi. Ro was born in a village in Afghanistan's central highland of Hazarajat, but was forced to flee his home. He arrived in Britain in 2004 and has since written extensively on democracy, human rights, and terrorism. He's currently an associate fellow at the Human Security Centre. And finally, Emmanuela Yogolelo, originally from Upper Zaire and Kivu in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Emmanuela is a singer-songwriter, live performer, workshop facilitator, speaker, and cultural leader. She has developed her passion for music from an early age, soaked in the musical surroundings of her native land. Her songs are full of tales and stories, and she recently showcased at home in Manchester a family-friendly interactive storytelling performance. This piece was supported by grants, including one from Counterpoints Arts, and was developed around the topic of climate justice as part of her climate justice activism through music and other art forms. Now, I'll pass over to Alex, Ro, and Emmanuela to speak more about the intersection between climate and refugees. But there'll be time for an open discussion at the end as well. So if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to put them into the chat or message them to me directly, and I'll save them and we'll take some questions at the end. But firstly, we're really happy to hand over to Alex.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks as ever to the hosts and organisers of the event. I'll just begin with a very quick introduction to myself and the project that I work on and say a little bit about that, and then I have a short presentation which I hope will act as a kind of overview, an introduction to the ways that climate change and migration are connected. I've been working on a project now for about a decade, which looks specifically at the ways that climate change influences all aspects of human mobility, migration, displacement, planned relocation. It looks at the ways in which climate change has the potential to reshape some of these patterns in the future. But specifically, the purpose of the project is to work with other civil society organizations and to work with them to ask the question, what will it mean to be a refugee rights organization, a migrant rights organization, a climate justice organization in an era where climate change is potentially reshaping the patterns of migration and displacement that we can see across the world? What might it mean for those organizations in terms of the people that they're working with, the policies that they are advocating for? What could it potentially mean operationally for organizations that are working with migrants and refugees? What might it mean in terms of advocacy and the kinds of laws and changes in policy that we are campaigning for? So that's what we do. We've been running this project now for over a decade, and we've worked with hundreds of different organizations, primarily in the UK and Europe, but also across the world. What I'm going to present now, hopefully in in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try not to take up too much time, is really just to give a sense of some of the basics of the ways in which changes in the climate, changes in patterns of disasters, which are in turn driven by climate change, can alter patterns of migration and displacement, and give a very quick overview of some of the reality of what that looks like. And I'm going to do that by presenting a couple of testimonies that that we've gathered and that partners of ours have gathered over the years, which are from people who have faced displacement in the context of disasters and in the context of a changing environment and a changing climate, and just pull out some key pieces from those testimonies that I think illustrate the connection between climate change and migration, and allow us to see, firstly, how these issues are connected, but also to see how they are connected through the reality for people who have experienced changes in their mobility, have experienced migration, experienced displacement that has in part been driven by climate change. So that's how I'm going to present this. We will delve into some of the theory in the academic literature that looks at it in the so far as 10 minutes allows that. But our starting point, our jumping in point, is going to be by looking at some of these testimonies as a way of examining this issue in more depth. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, if technically it is possible. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can all see my screen. It would be great. Yes, I'm getting a thumbs up from someone. Perfect. And now if I present, you should be able to fully see my presentation there. So the first testimony that I want us to examine comes from Mexico. It was recorded by a group of researchers nearly 10 years ago. And it looks at, it's a testimony from someone who migrated in the context of changing rainfall patterns and increased levels of drought in Mexico. And I'm just going to put this testimony up on the screen. I'm going to give you 30 seconds or so just to read the testimony yourself. I'm not going to read it out. I'm just going to let you digest what this person has said. And then I'm going to pick out some key things from the testimony that I think are really important and help us understand the connection that this person's experience has with climate change. So here is the testimony. So what I'm going to do is just highlight some key bits from this testimony and give you a very quick explanation of what I think they tell us. So the first one is, we can see here a really clear connection between drought and rainfall variability and this person's migration, right? What they are describing here is the fact that the rain is coming later, and that is affecting crop yields, and it is that impact on their livelihood that has meant that they have sought work elsewhere, right? So what's really key to understand here is the way in which climate change affects someone's mobility, maybe via the economy, right? This person was dependent for their livelihood on agriculture. Changing rainfall patterns affected the economy of the farm on which they worked. It meant that they couldn't employ as many people, and they therefore had to seek work somewhere else. And in this case, they had to move, they had to migrate, they had to cross an international border in order to do that. However, what we can see is that very often, and I think this perhaps goes against some of what we hear and see in the media, in the news, about the connections between climate change and migration. In this case, what we can see is that this person's migration was temporary and seasonal, and that they are adopting migration between two places, moving backwards and forwards between Mexico and the US every season as a way of securing and improving their livelihood. So what we're actually seeing there is migration being used as a livelihood strategy. And I think that's really important thing to remember about a lot of the mobility that we see as a result of climate change. This is a second testimony from a very different context, from Somalia. Again, I'm going to show you the testimony. I'm going to give you a few moments to read it, and then I'm going to pick out a couple of key things from the testimony that help us understand this issue, this context more deeply. Okay, so I hope you've had a chance to just read that quickly. There's one key thing that I want to highlight specifically from this testimony, and it's this. Very often, people face displacement in the context of climate change when they are experiencing an existing vulnerability. So very often, when we see people being displaced and we see climate change playing a role in their displacement, it is not exclusively climate change that has caused them to move. There are a host of other pre-existing vulnerabilities that mean that climate change is perhaps the final straw. That means that the drought, the climate change impacts, the hurricane, the typhoon, whatever it is the final factor amongst many others that causes their displacement. And what we can see here is someone explaining that, in fact, the initial vulnerability that they were experiencing was created by armed conflict and the failure or the inability of their government to provide them with support, perhaps as a result specifically of that conflict. The government was unable to provide them with the support which might have helped them weather this storm, might have helped them survive the climate impact that eventually has led to their displacement. So this is another really key point. It is very, very rare that we see climate change impacts exclusively on their own, creating migration or creating displacement. It's very rarely the case that it is solely a change in the weather or exclusively a drought or exclusively some kind of climate-related disaster that causes people to move. It is almost always connected with another existing vulnerability: extreme poverty, armed conflicts, poor governance, corruption. The list goes on and on, of course. But it is very often those factors which have created a pre-existing vulnerability that then leads to migration or displacement once a drought or another climate-related disaster strikes. So I hope those testimonies have been illustrative. I'm going to just mention a couple of key things that I think are important in the way that we understand climate change and its connection to migration and displacement that we can see from those testimonies. But these are trends that are broadly well supported by the research literature as well. The first one is about drivers, and it really just is to reiterate this initial point that I've made, right? It is very rarely climate change on its own which is a driver of migration. It often combines with other forces. So in the first testimony, what we saw was someone who was living in a situation, working in a situation where the economy was such that there was not alternative work nearby to them. And when climate change eroded the local economy, eroded local farming, they were forced to find work somewhere else, and that meant moving. Again, we saw something similar, but with armed conflict in the second testimony. And what that means is that when we're talking about the way that climate change plays a role in people's mobility, very often we talk about people having a climate change dimension to their movement, rather than referring to people as, quote, climate migrants or climate refugees. The wish here is to capture the fact that climate change is playing a role. It's one factor amongst many. So quite often in the academic literature, the expression, a climate change dimension to someone's migration or displacement is useful in capturing that. The second thing that I think is really important to mention is that climate change creates human mobility right across this migration versus displacement spectrum. And what I mean here is that we can look at human mobility as sometimes being more like displacement, where people are forced to move, they have very little choice about moving, moving is simply a question of protecting their own life, protecting their welfare. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have mobility, which is more like migration, where people have some choice about where and when they move, who they move with, and perhaps a little bit more agency in making decisions about where they live and where they move to. And what we can see is that climate change is creating new patterns of mobility right across this spectrum. Sometimes we see instances where it creates mobility that's more like migration, where people don't have complete choice, but perhaps they have some agency in making decisions about, for example, when they move. They might have some agency and some decision-making power in choosing where they move to, or who they move with, or when they return. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have instances where climate change impacts are creating patterns of mobility that are much more like displacement, where people have almost no choice and moving is simply an act of fleeing in order to survive. So it's important to remember that climate change is creating mobility right across this spectrum. And that means that there is no typical quote, climate migrant or climate refugee. It creates an incredible diversity of different kinds of mobility. The next really key point is to make a distinction between internal and cross-border movement. So climate change impacts at the moment are by and large creating new patterns of internal movement. Mostly people are moving within their own country without crossing an international border. This is the case both with climate-driven displacement, where people are fleeing sudden climate-related events like sudden floods, hurricanes, typhoons. People tend to move the shortest possible distance to find safety. But also when people are moving because climate change impacts like drought have eroded their livelihood, even in this instance, very often people are looking to move from a rural area to a nearby city. And they're doing this primarily because very often they have a desire to return. They may be hoping that their migration is not permanent. They're looking to move back to the location that they've left when the drought alleviates, or to move back in order to be part of reconstruction efforts after a disaster. And in general, this means that the shorter distance that someone has moved, the easier that return is. The easier it is to maintain connections with family and friends who maybe haven't moved, the closer people feel to home. So at the moment, climate change is, I would say, primarily driving patterns of internal mobility. People in general aren't crossing international borders. That doesn't mean that that won't change in the future, but again, it's important to remember that when we see perhaps some of these more apocalyptic headlines that suggest that millions or even tens of millions of people might migrate as a result of climate change, actually, very often those headlines are inaccurate. Very often they are driving a kind of fear. They're designed to try and illustrate a kind of apocalyptic vision of what climate-driven mobility might look like. And actually, the reality is somewhat different. The reality at the moment is that most of this mobility is internal rather than across international borders, and much more likely, if it does involve crossing international borders, to be between neighboring countries rather than from being, for example, from countries in the global south to countries in the global north. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not cases where that happens. That doesn't mean that there are not potentially cases in the future where that might happen more. But the key thing is to remember that primarily right now, climate-driven mobility is internal. So what we have is a few key trends that I think we need to be aware of. And these are the patterns that climate-driven mobility is taking at the moment and is likely to take over the next few years. The first one is displacement created by sudden disasters, and this will primarily be internal. The second one is erosion of livelihoods, and primarily this will create migration out of rural agricultural areas into growing cities. And then finally, a pattern of migration that we call planned relocation, which is where communities make a decision to move preemptively away from an area that they know is going to be vulnerable to climate change impacts. And rather than moving one household at a time or moving as an individual, they create a plan, often with the help of national or local government, to move out of an area before it becomes before its vulnerability increases to such a point as a result of climate change that it becomes difficult to live in. So I hope what I've done there in this presentation is give you a bit of an insight into, firstly, some of the ways that people describe their own migration and their own displacement, and describe how climate change has connected to those to their own experience. And then secondly, to give you a very quick overview of some of the key issues, the mechanics of how climate change events connect with human mobility. And then finally, a very quick summary of some of the key trends and key patterns that I think we need to be aware of at the moment, and some of the ways that climate change may drive new patterns of mobility in the future. So I'm going to wrap up there. I hope that that has been useful. I hope I've managed to provide a quick overview that will be useful in the rest of our discussion. And I'll hand over now to our next speakers.
Thank you, Alex. I'll hand over first now to Ro.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you, Alex, for that very important presentation. A very, it really educated me more than I, could have imagined about the impact climate change is having on people's lives around the world. But the part of Afghanistan, so I'm just going to give you a brief story of my own, part of the country where I came from. In the central highlands of Afghanistan, it's a very mountainous, rugged part of the world where it snows very heavily in the winter. And when I was a child growing up, winter was always the best of times because, when you're a child, you love snow. We used to get up in the morning, you see, knee-high snow, and the rest of the day would be spent, clearing the snow away from the rooftops and around the village. And that was fun. And although it was difficult, food was scarce, people were suffering from poverty and all the ills that come with it. But there is an anticipation in people's mind that the more snow you have throughout the winter, the better it's going to be throughout the year, because people primarily relied on their land for, to grow their food and live by it. And as times progressed, I just checked the date today. It was 22 years ago exactly to the day that I was smuggled into Iran. We walked all night through the mountainous region of Iran with a bag full of opium on our bags because, people smugglers often use, the people they smuggle as drug mules as well to get them through the borders. And that, in a sense, is a story of displacement in itself. But the thing about the part of Afghanistan that I come from is that the snow and the rain has kind of become rare and rare. In the last 20 years or so, 22 or 3 years that I have been away, there have been winters where there have not been a drop of snow throughout the whole winter. And last year, for example, there are only it didn't even rain throughout the winter. So you can see how difficult it is for the people who are already suffering. But you can see the impact of climate change on people's daily lives. And now people, all they had to do was, the last time the Taliban came over, people were persecuted, our family as well. A lot of people moved out of their villages and fled to the neighboring countries in Europe and America and elsewhere. And people have been largely surviving on subsistence that they've been receiving from their loved ones abroad. But those who have not been able to do it have to, leave the villages and go into, for example, cities like Kabul. Kabul is a very small city. It is a small area with, I think the last time I heard about it was 12 million people packed in it. Kabul was once known for its river. The Kabul River is the most beautiful river that you could see in the region, water flowing from the Hindu Kush mountain ranges. And if you go to Kabul now, beautiful river is no more, completely dry. And what is left behind is an empty space where the bed of the Kabul River is used by drug addicts and homeless people who have to sleep on it. And even in the harshest of winters, in the most kind of rainiest and snowiest winters, it never rained enough for the Kabul River to flow again. And you see these patterns of people moving around. And as the grim pictures of Afghanistan, you see the drought and the famine that is occurring around the country. One thing you have to look at is the famine is also impacting where they're most fertile. They are no longer fertile because of climate change, and people in those regions are suffering the most because people are not skilled enough to go outside and live in the cities, and also they cannot leave what they have behind. And the pictures that you get from across the country are not people starving. My initial understanding was that people will have a lot of difficult time in urban centers. Now you can see that people are having more and more difficulties in rural areas where they once depended on their lands to survive. And now those lands are no longer useful for those people to use. Now we come into, if you look at throughout our history of anywhere in the world where there's conflict, you will always see climate change as a key factor. You cannot separate climate change and conflict. Conflict often, it is the change of climate that breeds conflict. It's the wars have always been about fighting over distribution of resources. You have ideologies, you have religions about deciding how best to distribute those resources. But now that you have climate change gripping even harsher and harder as things go, climate change has become the key ingredient for conflict, whether it is in Afghanistan, for example, the ongoing civil war for decades. It has always been about the distribution of resources. If you look at, for example, in Iran and Turkey, geopolitical impacts of climate change have always, it's immense. You have hundreds of thousands of people being impacted. But now, because of the conflict that climate change breeds, you have societies entering into this vicious cycle of conflict where you have climate change causing conflict, war, displacement, mass atrocities, and then this in itself getting societies to come together and create institutions which will enable them to at least rid themselves of some of the ills that come from climate change. So you have a vicious cycle of violence, persecution, abuse, just because people do not look at to what is the key driver, the conflict. Whether you're in Syria, whether you're in Pakistan or somewhere in Africa or in Europe, you know that the root cause of every conflict and displacement is climate change. Because without climate change, there's an opportunity for people to come through and get into a settlement where they can distribute the resources. But with the climate changing continuously with the difficult and adverse effects, you have the scarcity of resources where people have to move away from their places they normally call home to places that they're othered, compete for a small amount of resources, where it's getting more and more scarce. So you inevitably have conflicts between people, which will, in a sense, the capacity of institutions ineffective because they have to deal with the conflict which is been born by climate change. So for me, I've never seen, there's never a separation of climate change and conflict. For me, one feeds from the other and enters into, societies into this vicious circle where it is very difficult to get out of. But of course, we in the West see ourselves very remote from the, real lived experience of these people who are suffering from. But I, speak to people daily around, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, and you can see the impact that this displacements have on people, because, being moved out of your homes and villages, it's not an easy choice. I get up every morning and think about the village I called home once, and it's something instinctive, but once you've been forced out of your home, your soul, I suppose, never settles. I will always remain a refugee. I was pushed out for different reasons, but always see climate change as a key part of that. Now, you talk of hunger. Hunger breeds conflict, and hunger has largely come from climate change, where people cannot grow the food that they need. And in 1997, 98, where you look at the Taliban and they used food against our people, the community that we come from, and because of the drought that affecting the region and the area, thousands and thousands of people died, and we didn't have enough food to eat. And I look at the pictures of young kids, sunken eyes, bloated stomachs, the pictures that you all see from Afghanistan, coming through your TV screens. I feel them because I watched my own little brother die in front of me out of malnutrition. I remember his sunken eyes. I remember his bloated stomach. It's fresh in my mind all the time. And I see the pictures, for example, you see from Africa to Asia to Afghanistan. These pictures are not new to me. They're ingrained in my mind all the time, and I go through it all the time and every time I see. But I don't see climate change separate from what caused to watch and see my little brother die in front of me out of malnutrition. And it was, a large part, although we were suffering from persecution by the Taliban, and there was a food blockade on the community of the Hazara people, but it would have been easier for our community had there not been a drought. I remember that winter, it didn't snow at all. And the river and the springs that people relied on to feed their land in order to get some food out were all dry, and people didn't get enough food, and thousands of people died. And when you talk about climate change, there's all lived experience of people. I remember that, and I know how it feels. And I know, when you see people in Afghanistan where people pleading the international community for aid, had it not been for climate change, most of these people wouldn't have needed aid. There's enough land in different parts of Afghanistan where people have been self-sufficient in producing their own food, but the lands are no longer useful. I spent 6 months in Helmand province when I fled out of my own village, and it's very fertile, but the families who used to grow and use those land in order to not only grow opium, for example. Why people grow opium? Because it's very climate change resistant. It's a very strong plant, and people cannot produce food for their families, but they have to grow opium. They have to rely on that. And even the places where people used to grow opium and then sell for, to get enough money out of it, they are unable to do that because of drought. And the only people who benefit from this, large criminal enterprises, forcing people into poverty and pushing them into avoiding to grow food, the energy in growing opium, where people are starving, but they'll have enough opium to grow. And the fact that it's happening is because people do not have enough water, enough arable land, and the land are being decayed. I remember, 1999, I could see the land decaying by the Helmand River. Helmand River, one is the biggest river in Afghanistan, and it was drying. Its source in the Hindu Kush Mountains were not having enough snow, and it's all because of climate change. You cannot separate conflict from climate change. The two, for me, are inseparable. One causes the other, and the other causes the other. And it just takes all the energy away from areas where there needed to be calm, where people can think strategically to manage their land and their environment. They no longer have that energy or ability or will to live in the areas where they see no benefit of. And I hope I'm just making a bit of sense here, but the context there for me is that, to reiterate again, where there's conflict, you can be sure that climate change is a key part of it.
Thank you so much, Ro. That was really interesting and really, really great to bring that kind of lived experience into the room. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'll just pass over to Emmanuela as well, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So if you haven't got any questions, I want to pop them in the chat now, I'll note them down. But if not, we'll pass on to Emmanuela for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Emmanuela, and thanks for our previous speakers who have really said everything that can be said about the link between climate change and migration or displacement. So I guess my presentation is going to be an attempt to also talk about or show that the link between climate change and displacement, it's not a simple subject. It's really complex, and it can have these layers and layers of other things, such as capitalism, inequality, injustice, past colonialism, neo-colonialism. Because sometimes we hear people talking about this primary effect of climate change and secondary, as if because one is secondary is less important or less pressing. But in some part of the world, of course, it seems like primary consequences of climate change is what makes sense to them. But in other part of the world, it's secondary effects of climate justice. Because for me, it doesn't matter if my displacement came out of drought, of global warming, those primary effects, but mine came from irresponsible mineral mining in Congo. Because the same global warming, drought, flood destroyed the environment. Mineral mining destroys the environment in Congo. So it doesn't matter for me if it's primary or secondary. So that's what is going to be my attempt to talk about these other layers, these other matters connected to the connection between climate change and migration. So bear with me, please. I'll be just reading from my laptop. Very often, the link between displacement or migration and war, armed conflict, and even poverty is easily appreciated, but not so when it comes to the link between displacements and what really starts some wars, armed conflicts, and poverty in the first place in countries where displaced people come from. In countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, what starts wars and armed conflicts there is not some bloodthirsty tribal people or corrupted politicians alone. What starts wars and armed conflicts in Congo is greed for profit. Greed for always more quick and easy profits by multinational companies, some international laws, and even leaders of some powerful countries. Our comfort in the West, or technological advancements such as green energy, smartphones, very often cost lives of innocent people in other parts of the world. History has shown that capitalism, past colonialism, and neo-colonialism destroy the environment, set up people against each other, and create world systems that keep global South citizens in perpetual poverty. It's only after capitalism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism have destroyed lives, the environment, and the hope for a future that insecurity, hunger, and poverty leads to displacement or migration. While change in weather patterns, global warming, droughts, and floods might be primary consequences of climate change, and my immigration is just a secondary effect of climate change, displacement is equally an important and pressing climate matter, especially today when we've started hearing the term climate refugees. It used to be war refugees.
Hello. Sorry, I've got a meeting on.
Is everything okay? While changing weather pattern, global warming, drought, and floods might be primary consequences of climate change, and migration is just a secondary effect of climate change, displacement is equally an important and pressing climate matter, especially today when we've started hearing the term climate refugees. It used to be just war refugees or even economic refugees. If yesterday only some people could become refugees because of war or economic instabilities, today or tomorrow, everybody or at least a wider people could become climate refugees. The thought of this should be enough for us to wanting to think hard about the question of the link between climate change, capitalism, past colonialism, neo-colonialism, migration, injustice, and inequality. People who contribute less to the destruction of the environment suffer the most from climate change, and some of these people are migrants. So this short presentation was my opinion and personal experiences of climate change from a justice point of view. It was also my understanding of the connection between climate change and displacement as someone coming from Congo. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuela. That was really powerful, and really grateful to all of our speakers today for inputting and giving us their experiences. So thank you so much. We have had a couple of questions in the chat so far. Happy to take them. They've been mostly for you, Alex, so I'll read them out. If anyone else has any questions in the meantime, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we can have a broader conversation with some of our speakers here as well. So the first question was from Natalia. To Alex, just out of curiosity, do you know if climate change is considered for granting international protection in the UK? And the second question, again for Alex, was from Lindsay. In your work, have you come across any solutions that have been particularly effective in helping communities to adapt to climate change, becoming more resilient?
Yeah, let me take those two in turn, but I mean, I get that those questions were pitched at me, but I'd like to come to each of our panelists on them as well, because I think there's some interesting things that they'll both have to say on those two. The question of international legal protection and climate change is currently a really controversial one, and broadly in the UK at the moment, the answer is no. Climate change cannot form part of someone's application for asylum, and that is by and large mostly true across the world. So I think that raises a couple of interesting questions, though. The first one is what are the legal options for people who need to cross an international border as a result of climate change impacts? And at the moment, the answer is, unfortunately, that is a kind of legal grey area. There is a lot of research work and some advocacy going on trying to work out how to fill that gap in legal protection, though. So yes, it's true that that is a problem, but it is also the case that there is a fair amount of thought, advocacy, campaigning going on, trying to plug that legal gap at the moment.
Thanks, Alex. Emmanuela or Ro, have you got anything that you wanted to add to any of those questions or comments? Ro, you're just on mute if you're wanting to add in.
Yeah, I don't have anything in particular on that to say, but I think when we talk of refugees, we always talk about people fleeing war and conflict and fear of death. But we have to, work on to create a new definition of what it means to be a refugee. People impacted by climate change are no less of refugee than somebody who fled from the Taliban, like I was. If you're no longer able to call your home, then you are a refugee. And climate change is causing people to flee their home because there's nothing in there for them. And we cannot blame them for it. We in the Western world are blessed with all the resources that we have. But what I see a dangerous trend in our political discourse here is turning fighting climate change as some sort of culture war, which is very dangerous. And that poisons not only the narrative around who's a refugee, but also what it means to fight climate change. We often try to put money, economic prosperity before climate, but without a healthy environment, there cannot be economic prosperity. It is madness to think that these simple, points are being lost in people think about we can postpone fighting climate for the next generation, for generations down the line, because we in the West are blessed enough, to have enough food. People are complaining about inflation going up 5%, 7%, but think about people who do not have food, who are starving because their land are no longer arable enough to give them food because of climate change. And now we need a bit of, a dose of reality and an injection of hard-hitting reality in people's mind to think climate change is not something far away from your home. Climate change is affecting people here. It's not far away. It's not somebody else's lived experiences. We all go through it. But, again, we just turn into different, and the fact that we have such disparity of wealth in Britain and people have to kind of, in a sense, move down south, as I've, learned in Britain, is because of that very thing. You can see climate change in everything. I'm paranoid about seeing climate change in everything, but the reality is this, and not enough people wake up to that. And again, when it comes to, we often talk about the phrases economic migrants around refugees. There is no economic migrant. If you do not have enough to eat in your own home, in your own village, in your own city, you have to move somewhere else. And that, in a sense, make you a refugee. And a refugee, because of climate change, is no longer less of a refugee than somebody who's fled their home because of climate change inflicted conflict.
Thank you, Ray. Just going to jump around in questions because we've had a few different ones coming in. There's a really interesting question here around the arts and what can the arts do to help in this crisis, if anything? Especially pointed, I guess, a bit towards more Emmanuela. Can you tell us a bit about your artistic work in relation to this intersection? I know we're also joined by someone from Teatro Vivo who may be able to jump into that conversation as well, but I'll pass to Emmanuela first.
Thank you. In terms of using art to raise awareness, to tackle, to take action for climate change, I guess I can think of two things. One being, I know it will sound like just a generic, but it's true. with art, because it's something subjective, because I don't have to interpret a drawing the way you interpret it. It's just a matter of my personal taste and interpretation. So that I think that's the thing about art and the topic of climate change, because it doesn't have to be the way you experience climate change. It's about how I experience it. Because in most of my talk, actually, when I first started this climate justice activism through music and other art form, the very one of the things that led me to start it off was when I realized, although climate change is a global crisis, it is experienced differently, depending on which part of the world you live in and who you are. People in Africa, my mom doesn't experience climate change the way I'm experiencing it here in Manchester, just because of the fact that she's in Congo. She's an old lady, she doesn't work, maybe economic, social status are different. So that's one thing. So, and that's why we're saying we should bring to the table, when we're talking about climate change, we should have all these different voices and experiences and opinions, because we don't experience it the same. And that way, I think art work, because in art we agree to disagree. We accept a different opinion on one thing. I think that's the magic of using art when we're talking about climate change, because you can just accept and respect what I'm sharing with you. Might not be your experience, but it's mine. That's how I live it. That's one thing. The second thing, I think, like we've all heard how music is an international language, and how somehow you can't explain it, but it has the power to bring people together. Sometimes we forget that usually I don't mingle with this type of people, but around a good jazz vibe, around some soukous or pop music, we forget that usually I don't mingle with those people. What matters, it's just they like that vibe, I like it as well, then we come together. And then it creates this space, safe space, when we can start conversation. I think that's a few of the things we can use with art when it comes to the topic of climate change. I hope I've answered to that question.
Thanks, Emmanuela. And I think that's a really great point of being able to come together and have more discussions around climate change. And I think as well, the power of art in hearing other people's opinions and experiencing that as well through art, I think is pretty magical. So yeah, thank you. That definitely really resonated. There's a few more questions in the chat. I'm conscious we only have 5 more minutes. So there's kind of some discussion, I think, around the kind of connotations of the word migrant, and too often being used in opposition to refugee. And I know we've touched on that a little bit. So I didn't know if anyone else had any more kind of thoughts on like how maybe we think about the phrasing of those words, and is there anything that we can do to kind of maybe changing the messaging. I know Refugee Week is really important around kind of the experience of refugees and how we make everyone feel welcome, but is there any more that any of our panelists want to kind of add to that discussion at all? Maybe I'm asking too broad a question.
I don't have a particular answer to that, because it is such a difficult subject and very politically, emotionally charged as well. And I feel unless we have a broader debate and a popular acceptance of climate change affecting people and forcing them to move away from the place they once called home. I mean, it's just that the acceptance of reality of what people are going through individually in their villages and homes, have through no fault of their own, are being punished for the collective act of humanity everywhere. They are the people who've been unlucky to be vulnerable enough to be hit by the collective action of people throughout our history, especially in the last, last century, since the Industrial Revolution, and since then, and the North-South divide of the world. So it's always this hammering home this message that it's always the weak and the vulnerable who suffer the most because of the action of the collective. And as long as we do not bring that sense of collectivity, that the overall general community, global community responsibility, and I don't think looking at it through country-specific individualistic basis, we can change the framing of what it is to become to be a refugee and what it is to be an immigrant. I think there's something for us all, I suppose, to think and find our own way of dealing with it.
Alex or Emmanuela, anything to add on that?
No, just to say thanks for having me, and I think it was really great to have someone like Alex and Drought, because I always say this, Alex will come from like an expert point of view, scientific point of view, academic, whereas me, I'm just coming raw as someone who has lived something. I don't even know the terminology for stuff. I just talk about lived experience, and Drought also can bring a diverse voice, because like I was saying, it's important. And again, for me, it's one of those things, it's not, there is no right or wrong. It's just, these different experiences and understanding and opinions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Emmanuela. I feel like maybe that's a good point to close on. I think, Emmanuela, you really articulated that really well. I was hoping this session today would be a great opportunity to kind of bring together that lived experience, the research, and hearing all sides, but also I think pointing in that kind of creative point as well about having opportunities to come together and discuss these topics and issues as a collective and work together to move forwards some of these discussions. So very, very grateful to our host today for providing us with this space. Exceptionally grateful to our speakers today. It was really great. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences. We know that refugees have a lot of kind of lived trauma, and like going through those conversations can be quite challenging. And we really are very, very grateful for you to coming and speaking with us today. Obviously, we have lots of things coming up, and I don't know if Almir, you want to speak more about Refugee Week before we go, another opportunity to come together. But I just wanted to flag from a Climate Coalition perspective, we have a similar moment to Refugee Week called the Great Big Green Week that happens from the 24th to the 2nd of October, 24th of September to the 2nd of October. And obviously that is another space that we welcome you all to. We want to make sure that we're having these conversations more around climate and refugees and displacement. And obviously you're welcome to join us in those moments as well. But I'll hand back to Almir to finish off and close. Thanks.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Emmanuela, Ro, Alex. Wonderful, really moving, powerful, very educational presentations and testimonies. And I hope we all feel we've learned something and we feel inspired to go and use this Refugee Week, as Grace just mentioned, to tell this hopefully powerful story of healing in relation to displacement and climate change. I look forward to seeing some of your responses, maybe meeting you in person or in these digital spaces. Refugee Week is from the 20th to 26th of June this year. Please stay in touch and keep us informed of your plans. Thank you all once again for being here and being such great listeners and participants. Thank you.